will begin by speaking of an old friend of mine and a very interesting person who is a Catholic theologian in Scranton, Pennsylvania. The subject of our talk is ultimately the opening verses of the Parsha, which changed the world. Vayomer Hashem el Avram, lech lecha me'artzecha me'moladecha me'beit avicha. And God said to Abram, go forth from your land, from your birthplace, from the house of your father, to the land that I will show you. And I will make you into a great nation and bless you, and your name shall be great. Those who curse you shall be cursed, and those who bless you shall be blessed. And through you, all the families of the earth shall be blessed. 4,000 years after these words were spoken, Maria Johnson, a Catholic professor of theology at the University of Scranton, was asked by her school to teach a course on the Bible, on the Hebrew Bible, which she called the Old Testament. This wasn't her area of expertise. And so originally she decided to approach the text the ways that she would any other piece of literature. She writes, most of my youth had been spent devouring huge Victorian novels at a rate of about 1,000 pages a week. I thought if I could approach the Bible as another big novel, I might get on with it better than I had previously. So she writes that, but Johnson, as she explains, was not just an academic. She was also a neighbor. And she lived, I wouldn't say in the Orthodox Jewish neighborhood of Scranton, Pennsylvania, because there isn't an Orthodox Jewish neighborhood, but she lived on the Orthodox Jewish block. And so day by day, as she left her home to go teach her class on a biblical story that happened a long time ago, what she saw was Jewish families, parents and children, mothers and fathers, calling out to their sons and daughters about prosaic matters, but using the very names of their ancestors, the very names that she, Maria Johnson, had seen in the class that she was teaching, the very names from what Johnson would call Genesis and Exodus. She would hear them saying, Tzipora, over here, honey, or put that down, Yosef. And it was then that Johnson realized that this was much more than just a work of literature, and it was much more than an ancient story. It was ongoing. She writes, the surprise and strangeness of it, of living down the road from descendants of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. This, she writes, jolted me out of my Bible as great literature phase. The story, she continues, very obviously was alive and well. You don't run into the descendants of Oliver Twist or find yourself living down the road from people who trace their ancestry back to Anna Karenina or Huck Finn. So Johnson perfectly captures here, I think, the wonder that it is to study the Torah together, and especially to study the story of Abram together. What sets the story apart from all others in the history of the world? The answer, of course, begins with the ideas that it contains. The story of Abram is linked to ideas, and of course, ultimately one idea, what John Adams highlighted in his famous letter to Adrian Vanderkamp, where he said something like, I will insist that the Hebrews have done more to civilize mankind than any other nation because they propagated the idea of an all-wise, all-knowing creator of the universe, which I believe to be the foundation of all morality and consequently all civilization. So certainly the story of Abraham, the story of the Bible, everything we're studying is about ideas. But to speak only about the Tanakh, the Torah's intellectual influence, would be to miss its miraculous uniqueness. What Maria Johnson is highlighting just by thinking about the block on which she lives in Scranton is the following. Many books have changed the course of humanity. Plato, Aristotle, Cicero, Thucydides, Locke, the Declaration of Independence, and so forth. But what Johnson keyed into is that what sets the story of Abraham apart is that it's the only ancient story from thousands of years ago that continues today, with descendants tracing themselves to the original characters, often utilizing the same language, giving their children the same names from generation to generation. Just running next door into self-identified family or descendants of Achilles or Odysseus or Confucius or Aristotle or Cicero or Julius Caesar. And you're not running into any of them in Scranton or Sydney or London or Rome or Shanghai or Athens. But the children of Abraham endure, survive, thrive, and transmit his beliefs today. And that is ultimately the wonder of this story. In fact, for many, I think that's kind of what spooks people about the Jews. Why would the Lord of all creation seek to perpetuate one family and indeed choose to be known through that family as the God of Abraham, the God of Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov? This parsha especially is not just about a series of ideas, it is about a family. And to understand this, we have to just first go back a little earlier to the first family that we meet in the Torah. So let's just go back to Breshit, the Genesis, just for a few minutes. You all know it, you just learned it. The world is created in 7 days. On the 6th day, we meet the first man. His very name connotes his material nature. He is called Adam, because he is from the Adamah, dust from the earth. But unlike the plants, birds, and animals that preceded him, his life is not just a mechanical manifestation of corporeality. He has a spiritual component, a divine breath that was breathed into him. His exalted status is reflected in the fact that, unlike animals, he can speak. And thus it is when he's first introduced to his spouse, the first sentence in all of human history is spoken. Adam says, "This one at last is flesh of my flesh. Lezot yitkare isha ki me'ish lukach hazot. This shall be called woman, because she was taken from ish, man." That's all he says. Now note, ladies and gentlemen, what doesn't he do? He actually, as Leon Kassa notes, Adam doesn't actually speak to his wife. And he gives her originally a typological name. He calls her woman, not a personal name. He doesn't engage the woman in conversation. He doesn't talk to her about his hopes and dreams. He doesn't even say to her, "Madam, I'm Adam." All he says is, "She comes from me." She is Isha, woman, because she comes from Ish. The first conversation in the Bible is actually not between husband and wife. It's between the woman and the serpent. And after the sin, Adam denies all responsibility. "The woman you gave me, God, she gave me the forbidden fruit. And really, it's all her fault and your fault, God." So at this point in the story, family as an institution appears doomed. The death of Adam is foretold. "Dust thou art, and to dust thou shalt return." And suddenly, upon pondering his mortality, he gives his wife a personal name. He calls her Chava, Eve, which means Aim Kol Chai. Or as Leon Kass writes, Adam in awe and gratitude names her anew as mother, this time with no reference to himself. Through children, male and female finally achieve some genuine unification. The two become one through sharing generous, not needy love for this third being as good. So he writes, and the point is that it's through the possibility of love and creation beyond oneself that is the source of hope in a fallen world, or at least in a sinful world. But even as Adam understands that children are now the source of his immortality, we never actually encounter Adam as a parent. We don't see him engaging his child or teaching his child at all. As my great uncle, Rabbi Joseph Soloveichik, noted, it's very striking that whereas the first woman in all of creation, who sacrifices to bring children into the world, her name connotes motherhood. But Adam's name has nothing to do with fatherhood. And it is only 20 generations later where we actually meet a man whose name is linked to the concept of father, which signals to us that family and fatherhood is central to his story. We're introduced at the end of last week's reading to a descendant of Noach's son Shem by the name of Abram. This is the beginning of the 2nd millennium BCE. The civilization of Sumer is at the center of achievement. Paganism suffuses the earth. Nature itself is seen as divine. If we want to have a genuine understanding of what the theological beliefs were of everyone at this time, we don't actually need to study the history of the ancient Near East. We just need to watch one of the cinematic achievements of our time, which is Groundhog Day. Because, of course, that is a story of being trapped in time. And if you see time as cyclical, well, that means that there's actually nothing to achieve, nothing new to create. And as the writer Thomas Cahill points out in his book, The Gifts of the Jews, that's actually how people saw time in those days. They looked up at the stars, which they saw as divine. They saw endless cycles, and they assumed that that was what life was like on earth as well. Human lives were an endless cycle of birth and death. There was no goal toward which to strive, nothing new to seek to accomplish. And then, suddenly, this man, Abram, is addressed by God, and he tells him to change his life and change the world. Leave your house. Go to the other end of the continent, and I will make you into a great family and a great people. According to the beliefs of this civilization, the notion that anything genuinely new could occur would have seemed impossible. Thomas Cale points out that had Abram told anyone about this, he writes, they would have laughed at Avram's dream and pointed to the heavens where the life of earth had been plotted from all eternity. In the ancient world, Cale continues, Avram would have been given the same advice that wise men as diverse as Heraclitus, Lao Tzu, and Siddhartha would one day give their followers. Do not journey, but sit. Meditate on its ceaseless and meaningless flow. That's what Cale points out, writes. But Avram, of course, does not sit. He does journey. He follows through on this promise. We actually don't know why God chooses him just from this text here. God does not say why he's speaking to Avram, why he makes this promise to him. It is obvious, of course, that he believes in this divine being and that he will listen to this call because of what happens next. We have two more words right after God's command to Avram to leave his home. Two words in Hebrew, three in English. Vayelech Avram, and Avram went. Thomas Cale writes in his book, The Gifts of the Jews, that these are actually the most significant words in the history of civilization, that he actually went for it, that he broke the Groundhog Day way of thinking, that he created a new way of thinking, that time could progress, could move forward. Or as he writes, out of Sumer, civilized repository of the predictable, comes a man who does not know where he is going, but goes forth into the unknown wilderness under the prompting of his God. And he adds, out of mortal imagination comes a dream of something new, something better, something yet to happen, something in the future. So Avram goes, and we know that his faith fuels his journey, but why has he been chosen? The standard interpretation is that he is the only monotheist. He's the only one who knows about and believes in God. They actually teach this in Jewish day school, but this isn't true. It can't be true. We know this because this concept is belied by what almost immediately happens later in this week's Torah reading, which is that not long after Avram's arrival in the land of Canaan, he meets a mysterious king who also seems to serve as some sort of cultic priest, Melchizedek, king of Shalem, which is Jerusalem. And we know that he is the Kohen Le'el Elyon, a priest to the Most High God, whom he refers to as the Konei Shamayim Va'aretz, the creator of heaven and earth. So there are other monotheists, in other words. The fact that Abraham is a monotheist is essential, but that can't be why he's chosen. So we haven't yet discovered what makes him singular, why God embraces him. So for this, we turn to the very next part of the parasha. The Almighty informs Abram that because of his faith, because he answered God's call, he would be greatly rewarded. Now at this point, Abram has obeyed everything that God has asked of him. But suddenly, instead of responding with gratitude, he reacts with a plaintive plea. He says, Ma titenli, v'anochi holech ariri. What are you going to give me, God? I have no child. It's astonishing. The God he's followed across a continent promises him reward beyond imagination. And his reaction seems to be audacious. Chutzpahdik. So what? I want a child. But God's not angered by the reply. He takes him outside his tent and tells him that your descendants will be as numerous as the stars. Seemingly, the fact that Avram desperately desires to be a father is actually part of the reason, or the source of the reason, for God's love for him. It's the very reason why it is Avram, not other monotheists like Melchizedek, the king of Jerusalem, that will be the vehicle for God's providential plan. Avram is not the only individual in the ancient world to know of a creator, but he is the first to have a dream of founding a family that would transmit this faith from generation to generation. Avram, in other words, is the first to truly dream of combining physical perpetuation with moral transmission. We saw that Adam was a physical being endowed with speech and spiritual capacity, but Adam saw in his children biological continuity and nothing more. Avram, in contrast, wants to make his family the vehicle of faith. He doesn't just want to bring children into this world, he wants to teach them and to raise them. That's why God falls in love with Avram. He will say that in next week's Torah reading. Ki yidativ, I have known him, I have loved him. Leman asher yitzavet banavet beito acharav, because I know that he will teach his children and household after him to keep the ways of God. to uphold justice and righteousness. The creator of the whole world calls himself the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob because he wants a family that perpetuates the knowledge of his existence from parent to child. Abram is chosen not just because he is a monotheist, but because of his potential as a father, as the creator of a family. And that explains why soon after this promise of a child, God informs Abram that his wife would bear him a son. Abram, of course, says, I already have a son, Ishmael, seemingly thinking that the fact that Ishmael is his son is enough. And even he, this great father, has to be taught that to raise a covenantal family, you need a covenantal mother as well, which is why the child has to be a child from his covenantal partner, whose name is also changed. Avram's name is changed from Avram, which means great father, to Av Hamon Goyim, father of a multitude of nations. And his wife's name is changed from Sarai, my princess, to Sarah, humanity's princess. And this hints to the fact that Avram and Sarah, through their lived example, communicate to all the world God's vision of what it means to be a father and a mother. Just as God, out of love, creates the world, so too Avram's dream and Sarah's dream is to imitate God by bringing life into the world and by making that life know God. I remember I heard Rabbi Sachs once quote a Jewish woman who remarked, she said, now that I'm a parent, I know what it's like to be God, because now I know what it's like to create someone you can't control. It's a funny statement, but it's very true. And Rabbi Sachs, after he quoted it, he noted that he said, I was once tempted to write to the great physicist Stephen Hawking after reading his book, A Brief History of Time. It was Stephen Hawking who said that, he quoted Stephen Hawking that said that if you create the unified field theory, you would know the mind of God. And Rabbi Sachs said, I wanted to tell him that from a Jewish perspective, you don't need theoretical physics to come as close as we can to the mind of God. All we need to know what it is, all we need is to know what it is to be a parent. It is parental love that is the heart of Avram and Sarah's elevation. And the bond between parents and children is placed at the center of the Jewish faith, which is why the commandment that follows next becomes the symbol of the covenant, circumcision, the obligation to mark our sons' generative organs. We thereby sanctify the obligation to bring children into the world. By marking our sons, we remind them of our own obligation to continue Avram's dream of fatherhood. We remind parents that every child born to us is a gift, just as the announcement of Yitzchak, Isaac in this week's reading, born in next week, marked a miraculous gift to Avram. Jews see every child born as a miracle. And that, of course, lies at the very heart of Jewish endurance and eternity. It was Spinoza, who left Jewish peoplehood and faith, who pondered why Jews still existed. Perhaps a particularly perplexing question to him, because Spinoza believed that after the destruction of Jerusalem and upon achieving exile, the Jews ceased to be a people. So Spinoza said that Jewish observance made Jews weird, and that's set them apart as a people. Or as he put it, this is in no way surprising, since they have separated themselves from other nations to such a degree as to incur the hatred of all, and this not only through external rites alien to the rights of other nations, but also through the mark of circumcision, which they most religiously observe. So as for Spinoza, we made ourselves different through mitzvot, the people hate us, and that's what sets us apart. But I actually think the truth is the reverse. In the midst of hate, what allowed Jews to endure is actually what Judaism embodies with its very birth, which is that Jews see the continuity of Judaism through perpetuation, through the birth of children and the raising and teaching of children, as the greatest gift of all, a source of light even in the midst of the darkest of ages. I actually had the chance to reflect on this when my oldest son, who is now married, when he was born December 18th, so his bris took place on December 25th. And my friends found this very amusing because I was doing a doctorate I was doing graduate work at the time in Jewish and Christian thought, and so everyone went around to wish me a Merry Christmas. But it actually, on that day, led me to ponder the nature of fatherhood and how the cry of the child at the bris seemed to reflect Jewish cries throughout history. And the joy at that moment captured the very source of our endurance. At a bris, the father and mother are blessed with the same word that is applied at the celebration of the birth of a daughter when the daughter is named. That the parents should merit to raise their children to a life of Torah, the wedding canopy, and good deeds. Torah, chuppah, and ma'asim tovim. Now, to the outsider, these words might seem odd. Your child has just been born, or at the bris, the child is 8 days old, and we're already envisioning the child's wedding. But the point is, of course, that we are telling father and mother that it is our obligations as parents to ensure that the life they lead is a Jewish one, a continuation of Abram and Sarah, so that our children can, in turn, continue our own story. This, in the end, is what it means to study the Parsha of Lech Lecha. The standard way of telling the story is Abraham is chosen because only he knows about God. This, as I have explained, is not true. We meet someone else in this very Torah reading that knows about God. And of course, it is striking that the man who knows about God, the other monotheist, is the high priest of Jerusalem, of Shalem. Avram, of course, could only have been chosen if he was a monotheist. But he wasn't merely chosen because he was a monotheist. He was chosen for his role as the founder of a family, teaching all of us what it means to be a member of a family and serving as a link in generations. Perhaps the most striking bris that I've ever seen on video was one that I came upon on October 8th, 2023, right after Yom Tov ended for me, and I went online for the first time since October 7th. And of course, you're immediately, as you all recall, immediately bombarded by images of horror. But in the midst of that, there was also a video, which many of you may have seen, of a soldier being called up to service in the IDF, who is therefore missing his child's bris. And so he is watching it on Zoom on his phone in full military gear. And his friends, his comrades at arms, are standing around him, as it were, attending virtually the bris. And you hear him participate in the bris and to say the blessing of blessing God who has obligated him to bring his son into the covenant of Abram, and then saying the blessing Shechianu, who has allowed him to live to see this moment. It was a video, of course, that highlighted, as the enemies of the Jews stress, how Jews love life as their enemies love death. But it also reflected the very essence of Jewish endurance, the miracle of Jewish endurance, which we have felt during these past very difficult years of challenge, but also years of wonder and inspiration. I want to close, however, with a slightly earlier bris story. And the tale concerns also a bris that took place in Israel. It concerned a rabbi by the name of Meir Soloveichik, who's the Chabad rabbi on the island of Cyprus. He and his wife were expecting a baby due on March 19th, 2020. Think through that date for a second. He had originally planned to have the family mohel travel from Israel, right nearby, to Cyprus to perform the ceremony. But on March 12th, as new COVID rules went into effect, the mohel informed the rabbi ahead of the birth that the travel in and out of Israel would obligate him to then quarantine himself upon return and miss many other brises. So he couldn't come. Meanwhile, the rabbi himself couldn't go to Israel because then he would be quarantined there. So Rabbi Bayich found another mohel who was willing to come, but then Cyprus shut its airport. So now his baby's born. So he's trying to think about how to have a bris. He has no mole in Cyprus. So he hatched a plan, which sounds like a Jewish version of Mission Impossible, which is that Shimshon, that a mole named Shimshon would board, that he would take a boat from Cyprus, and meanwhile, the mole would depart Tel Aviv, the mole's name is Shimshon, on another watercraft. They would meet in the water. Shimshon would board the Bayich boat, and the circumcision would be performed in the middle of the Mediterranean. And he's being interviewed on a podcast. I heard Rabbi Bayich be interviewed about this, and he's asked, "You were ready to take your newborn son on a boat and have him circumcised in the middle of the sea?" And Rabbi Bayich, who's Israeli, has the greatest Israeli reaction. He goes, "Sure, no problem." He says, not like a small boat, a big yacht, a very nice one. He says that Shimshon the mole was ready to do it, and he was, as Rabbi Bayich put it, a very cool guy. But by the time the bris time came, Cyprus had closed its port. And so, as the podcast put it, I think it's the podcast Israel Story, Yair's circumcision naval operation was dead in the water. So now, this poor rabbi goes weeks without being able to circumcise his son. And then he reaches out to the interior minister of Israel, and a different operation was planned. A small private plane was arranged. The rabbi and his wife and the family took 10-minute flight to Tel Aviv. But under quarantine rules, he wasn't allowed to enter Israel. And so they had a room with glass walls before passport control in the airport, set aside for the bris. The mole met them there, and they don't officially enter the country. And their whole family in Israel attends the bris from the other side of the glass. They do the bris, and they board the plane, fly 10 minutes back to Cyprus, and there they have to quarantine with the baby for 2 more weeks. Now, to revisit that story reminds ourselves the craziness of that time, of course. But it also makes you think, as I thought, what kind of country would turn itself inside out for one circumcision? What sort of government interior ministry in the most bureaucratic country on earth? I hope it's not saying anything bad about Israel to call it the most bureaucratic country on earth. What sort of government interior minister would come up with a complex bureaucratic immigration scheme on behalf of one baby so that he could visit an airport for a 20-minute religious ritual? And the answer, of course, is linked to the fact that Israel is the only Western-style democracy where children are being born at a rate high above replacement amongst Jews on all places on the religious spectrum, a country formed by a people that treasured raising children above all else, a country whose delight in children as a gift from God is what sustained them through centuries of exile so they could return to their land. And so the ceremony went forward. And another way of thinking of it is 4,000 years after Abram and Sarah defied the Groundhog Day pagan predictions of his age to journey to the Holy Land, and soon after bring a child into the covenant, a rabbi makes his own journey to the Holy Land to bring his child into the covenant. Thomas Cale concludes one of his chapters in the book, concludes his book on the gifts of the Jews by saying that because of Abraham's journey, he writes, because of Abraham's defiance of pagan fate, he concludes that, quote, most of our best words, new adventure, surprise, unique, individual, person, vocation, time, history, future, freedom, progress, spirit, faith, hope, justice, are the gifts of the Jews. And Maria Johnson was right. Nothing captures Avram's tale more than the fact that even today, Jewish parents lovingly call out to their Jewish children, just on a day-to-day basis, revealing the power of parental love and sacred transmission to be more powerful than our persecutors, and teaching the world the blessing of parental, familial faith and love. Maria Johnson, writing about her Jewish neighbors in Scranton, seems to sense this, reflecting on the Jewish homes that are next to hers, and the fact that many enemies have attempted to destroy them. She writes that, quote, "It defies all conceivable logic that a tiny nation like Israel should have survived, while civilizations and empires have arisen, triumphed, and crumbled into oblivion. But in defiance of logic, here they are, a blessing to the nations and a blessing to me," end quote. Not everyone, of course, sees the Jewish people as Maria Johnson does. The 2 years that have passed are also a reminder of that. But at the same time, we can study this parsha as a source of inspiration and joy. Almost 4,000 years ago, God called out to Abram and told him to found a family. And 4,000 years later, parents reify the astonishing fulfillment of his dreams just by creating Jewish homes in Scranton, Pennsylvania, or in Manhattan, or in Miami, or in Yerushalayim, and anywhere else in the world. And it's in recognition of this miracle that this week, Avram's tale continues to call out to all of us. Thanks very much, everybody, for having me.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rabbi. That was truly inspiring and profound. I'd like to open up for anyone that has any comments or questions or anything to discuss.
That was beautiful. Thank you, Reno.
Thank you.
I want to tell
any questions, please.
Rabbi, I just want to tell a story that highlights what you just said. I was I had the opportunity to meet Rabbi Lau, the chief rabbi, who has a tremendous story. If anyone hasn't read Out of the Depths, I highly encourage you to read it. It's a Holocaust survival story. It's also the story of the birth of Israel, of somebody who landed sort of a feral, illiterate child at age 8 and on the shores of Jaffa, and eventually became chief rabbi. And I discovered a distant familial relationship thanks to Rabbi Soloveichik. So I looked him up, and he welcomed me into his home. But not once, not twice, 3 times I was sitting with him, and he referenced his family, his survival, but 3 times he did this. He said, "I have 62 grandchildren," and he like this. He said, "That is my revenge." Yeah. And it really highlights, and I've had many conversations with his son, David Lau, and it goes back to this, whether it's Lech Lecha or many other stories, just the importance of this and why we go, like our morning prayers, we reference our patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and everywhere through it, starting the beginning, we have long lists of the lineages of whether it's Adam's children and how Abraham linked, and then in subsequent chapters. It's very interesting. And I didn't really have a question. I just wanted to pontificate a little bit and share my just how profound that it's simple but very profound. And any of us that have the blessing of being a parent realizes how central family is to our faith and to our lives as Jews.
So actually, just to add to build on that, Dan, it's so striking you mentioned that. So actually, at the end of Rabbi Lau's memoir, which is he ends by saying that at his first son's bar mitzvah, and I actually mentioned this in Dan's home, I think when we met Rabbi Lau's son, who was then the chief rabbi. So he said at his son's bar mitzvah, he spoke, and he said that he referenced the pasuk, the verse that was in his son's bar mitzvah parsha, which was about Amalek, and the phrase is that there's milchama Hashem ba'Amalek midor dor. He said there was a battle of God's battle against Amalek from generation to generation, and he homiletically interpreted it as the way we battle Amalek is in the connection between generation and generation. That ultimately is how we have survived all the Amaleks of our age, by creating the link of generation to generation. It's very meaningful that you reference it, actually, Dan, because I quoted that book and this at one of my son's brises, because one of my sons was born right before Yom Ha'atzmaut. So I spoke the Shabbat before Yom Ha'atzmaut, and I quoted his book. It's hard to describe a greater embodiment of the miracle of Israel than the fact that the youngest survivor of Buchenwald would be found behind a pile of dead bodies by an American Jewish chaplain and would become the chief rabbi of Israel. So I'm grateful to Dan for mentioning that.
I had just a quick comment. I kept thinking about this uh this tweet that I had seen about this. There was a recent, sort of quantum observation of particles. What they're observing is that basically like time actually loops back and folds on itself, so that particles that get entangled can actually impact the past.
Yeah.
So and what they are doing, that when you affect something with particles that are entangled, it actually doesn't behave in a linear time fashion.
Right.
That it's all sort of one substrate. And it's sort of, it just kept thinking about it relative to your commentary,
Oh,
because
yeah.
in many ways, like, we are affecting Abraham
Yes.
in the future determines the past, and that we are all kind of part of this substrate. And it's a really powerful sort of, what they're proving on the quantum level
Yes.
has really powerful sort of implications for Judaism.
So no pun intended. I could talk for a long time about this, actually, about time, because so first of all, it's amazing you mentioned about impacting Avram. When the rabbis in the medieval period, which came up unfortunately all too often, the question they raised was, usually at a bris you say, let the father rejoice, let the father and mother rejoice. The father should rejoice in the fruit of his loins, and the mother should rejoice in the fruit of her womb. What do you do if one of the parents is not alive? In other words, if the mother has died in childbirth, God forbid, or the father has died. And then you could still say that the father rejoice. And that the proof is because we say on Shabbat in our prayers, Avraham Yagel Yitzchak Yiranein, is that we say, as we think about our own observance, we say that Abraham rejoices and Yitzchak will sing. And so if you read the writings of my great uncle, Rabbi Soloveichik, one of the things he writes about is the Jewish relationship with time. And it's because I think when he was doing his doctorate at University of Berlin in the 1920s, that was at the time when quantum theory was just sort of making its way into intellectual consciousness. And so it deeply impacts his own writings about Judaism. And so he has this notion that Jews have what's called a unitive time consciousness. That's his unitive time consciousness. And he says, and that's true also about repentance too, by the way. He says Spinoza and Nietzsche said that repentance makes no sense because you can't impact the past. So what's the reason of worrying about it, right? And he says that's not what Judaism believes, actually. Is that we have that because God himself is outside of time and is at the heart of the covenant, through God and through the covenant, we can actually go forward and backward. I gave a whole sermon once. There was you can look this up. There was a group of students at MIT that had a conference on time travel. And as a joke, though I'm not sure if they were joking, they invited people from the future. Is that what they said? Is that they put a fenced off area and then they took an invitation and they buried it in a time capsule. And they said, we hope that people in the future, in a time where time travel is invented, will discover this and they'll come back, and we've given them the coordinates, and they'll come back and attend our conference. But nobody came. But what I said was, I spoke about this. I said, actually, true time travel is found not only in physics, but in faith. And and I think quantum physics, if you look at my great uncle's writings, and we could talk about this offline another time, I have a whole talk on this about how quantum mechanics and Einstein and relativity impacted my great uncle's writings about Judaism. So it's a phenomenal point. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much. That was really beautiful and inspirational. So I heard you say, and it's kind of clear, but it's still a little bit murky. So I just want to drill down and get something a clear kind of difference. You're saying that basically, it sounds like what you're saying is that Shem and Melchizedek and like people at the time kind of knew about monotheism.
Yeah.
Maybe they were kind of like philosophers who had kind of, in an abstract sense, deduced that there's one God, and there's something different about Avraham, and it involves families.
Yes.
But it's still not 100% clear to me exactly what that difference is.
There's a statement you hear all the time and a question you hear all the time. The statement you hear all the time is, Avram was chosen because he's the first monotheist. right? So like that's the other famous response to the poem, How Out of God to Choose the Jews, is no news, not odd, we Jews chose God, right? Like that's the standard thing people say. And the point I'm making is that's necessary, of course, but not sufficient. That's not sufficient because there are clearly people that know about God. We meet Chanoch right beforehand. Vayetalech Chanoch et Elokim ve'einenu ki lakach oto Elokim. And then we meet Malki Tzedek, whether he's Shem, as the Medrash says, or he's somebody else. And the fact that he's monotheistic is important because that's linked somehow to Yerushalayim, right? That somehow, even in a pagan world, monotheism has survived in Jerusalem. But that's not why he's chosen. As I understand it, and I'm deeply impacted by the thinker on whom I wrote my doctorate, which is Michael Wishograd. I think God, though Michael doesn't say this in this way, philosophy is necessary but not sufficient, right? And in the end, I tend to believe that the greatest argument for God comes not for, and I think this is my own version of Rabbi Yehuda Halevi's critique of philosophy. In the end, the greatest argument for the existence of God is not the medieval arguments, but the miracle of the Jewish familial story. As Maria Johnson said, the fact that 4,000 years later there's someone doing as natural as just saying, Tzipora, come here, or Yosef, don't ride your bike. The fact that I just said, I took my son named Yosef to school today, all right? That's kind of, 4,000 years after Yosef. That's kind of wondrous. So, and I do think I'm sympathetic to, without getting too much into this, though, I think Zohar wants to get in on this, so maybe we can have a philosophical discussion more. But I'm sympathetic to Yehuda Halevi. Yehuda Halevi famously says, right, that he believes that Abram was a philosopher who discovered God. But that was until he discovered God and then God spoke to him. Once he meets the covenantal God, then his focus is on raising a covenantal family, not first and foremost on discovering the cosmic creator through a cosmological argument. So I value philosophy. Anybody who wants to market his PhD in philosophy of religion from Princeton, like myself, if I want to monetize that, I'm not gonna, dismiss philosophy, obviously, but in the end, being a father to me is more important even than being a philosopher or a theologian.
25 years ago, I read a book. Well, I didn't really read the whole book because I didn't understand most of it. It was called Genesis of the Big Bang, and also The Science of God by Gerald Schroeder. And we talked about physics a few minutes ago, and it's a phenomenal story. I'm sure, Rabbi, you know it, where he basically takes Einstein's theory of relativity, physics, and through that proves that the stories that we read in the Torah are true. And it's quite extraordinary. I don't remember anything of sort of what I'll call time travel.
Yeah.
But I just remember the way the time expands at an incredible rate, which is how all the data points make sense from the Torah. So I just want to
it's amazing. All right, Benji, maybe I'll send it to you. You could share with everybody. My cousin, Rabbi Meir Soloveichik, Rabbi Soloveitchik's grandson, has this fascinating piece somewhere. He's writing about repentance, but he's writing about, he quotes a quantum physicist. There's a quantum physicist who wrote a very funny book. I forgot what it's called. I think it's called something like time travel tourism for beginners or something like that. And he discusses the important arguments against time travel too, which is the MIT story. Like, if there really was time travel, why haven't we met any time travel tourists? Like, if the time travel was possible in the future, wouldn't they have come back to Cleveland to see the Cubs win the World Series in 2016, the most important event in the history of Western civilization? Obviously they would have, right? So why did we not meet them? Things like that. But he actually, Rabbi Twersky, who's brilliant and is Meir Soloveicik's grandson, goes side by side quoting his grandfather's writings about time in Judaism and quantum mechanics. And it's just striking. And the point is, it's not a coincidence. Rabbi Soloveitchik is thinking about this at the time when quantum mechanics is being discovered. And the entire notion of time is being reconsidered.
Amazing.
So, not a coincidence.
So I think that Hashem having two names
Yes.
might be the key to the difference between
100%.
the God of the philosophers and the God of worshipers.
Right.
And it relates to the idea that Hashem says to Abraham, I will make your name great.
Right.
One reading of that is that people will know who Abraham is, even though he doesn't have a social network. Don't worry, you'll still be able to find your way. But I like your suggestion that every time we invoke Abraham during the bris, that's actually the fulfillment of Hashem saying, I'll make your name great.
Right.
Especially because it contrasts with the Tower of Babel, where they say, let us make a name for ourselves, but
Right.
nobody is named in the story.
Yeah. No, that's beautiful. I mean, I think Leon Cass is right that ultimately Genesis should be read as sort of the basic a contest of civilizations, of how once death enters the world, once mortality becomes a reality, what is our response to reality? So the Tower of Babel is exactly as you say, right? It's whether you read that as the collective of the state or something else. Then there's Mitzrayim, which is, of course, Mitzrayim is through personal bodily immortality. I mean, basically, Egyptian theology is captured in the Woody Allen statement, where Woody Allen said, I don't want to live on in the hearts of my countrymen. I want to live on in my apartment, right? Like that's basically Egypt. And then there's Avraham, which is Mesorah, transmission. I'll share, by the way, Zohar and everyone, that I did this conversation recently with Bishop Barron. That's this wonderful guy. He has this very prominent Catholic show on YouTube called Word on Fire. And he asked me, what does it mean when God introduces himself as Ehyeh Asher Ehyeh? And I basically cited Maimonides' philosophical reading, and I said, but I don't think that's right. And I said, and I was giving a Halevian thing, quoting Rabbi Sachs, actually. And then he responded, because he defended Maimonides. And so I'm as you said, I don't know if I was ever a recovering philosopher. I'm a recovering philosophy major, I guess I should say. But I found, like, what is going on? Like, I'm sitting here in a Catholic TV show having a bishop defend Maimonides, And then I noticed afterwards that people wrote on the bottom, it's so funny that I'm with the rabbi, but the bishop was defending Maimonides, or something like that. So yeah, I'm with you 100%. I think what you said is beautiful. And of course, the two names of God are at the heart of Rabbi Soloveitchik's notion of covenant and the Lily Men of Faith as well.